Oh. All right. Welcome to another Open Team in-depth series. Today we've got the Nori team with Christoph and Ryan, who are going to give us an update. As a reminder, please mute yourself if you're not speaking, and then you can put your questions in the chat, and then we'll also pause for questions and have plenty of time at the end for dialogue. With that, take it away, Ryan, Christoph.
Thanks so much, Dorn, and thank you to everyone who's joining the call. It's great to be part of this community. I wish that everyone has had a successful 2019 and is looking forward to great things in the year ahead. So today we will cover a bit of an overview of what Nori is, how Nori works, what we're looking for as we scale up the marketplace, and get into some of the overlapping interests specific to the open ag community and some of the things that we're working on, which we hope are relevant and highly synergistic. So I'm Christoph Jospe. I'm one of the founders. I'm Chief Development Officer, which means I wear a lot of hats, and I'm obsessed with thinking of ways to bring supply of carbon removal into the Nori carbon removal marketplace. And Ryan, do you want to introduce yourself before I take it away?
Yeah, hey, I'm Ryan Anderson. I have been with Nori since January of this year. I am based in Chicago, and I am the supply development lead. So working very closely with Christoph on bringing supply into our new marketplace. So happy to be here.
Yeah, and I'd just like to call out, Nori's been around since the summer of 2017, and early days, there was a lot of key stakeholders. And as someone who doesn't come from an ag background, chatting with Dorn actually was pretty influential in developing some of the philosophies that Nori has, specifically around the challenges that farmers are facing with data and the roles that open data can play. So I have a lot of gratitude for those learnings. At a high level, Nori is a new carbon removal marketplace. So we issue a digital asset which represents 1 ton of CO2 removed. It used to be called a carbon removal certificate. We changed the name to a Nori carbon removal ton because we wanted to brand it much like the other registries or standards bodies, and also to actually have the unit of measure. And so sort of shorthand, it's just people are selling tons or Nori tons. And so suppliers, which is really any entity that can remove carbon dioxide and verify that activity occurred, is able to sell these assets in the Nori marketplace. We're sort of sticklers to say these are not carbon credits. We really use the word asset, although it can be easily sort of indistinguishable from a carbon credit, and oftentimes farmers even call this carbon credits. Candidly, we don't always correct them, but asset is the correct term for the unit that's being sold. So at a very high level, the way that it works is that the carbon is removed. This satisfies a criteria in carbon markets of additionality. So basically, someone needs to do something additional above and beyond that would be removing carbon dioxide. We take the data in that proves this additionality, and then we generate a report that a third-party verifier attests to be true. So upon the verification and a positive verification report, Nori issues NRT. When they sell, the supplier gets paid. Nori's revenue model is to take a 10% transaction fee on top of what the buyer pays. And so what that means is we get paid when the supplier gets paid, and it's in our interest for the supplier to get paid as much as possible and to make that as easy as possible. We're different from traditional carbon markets in a number of ways. So first, we're dedicated carbon drawdown. So carbon offsets or carbon credits oftentimes represent both carbon avoidance as well as carbon removals. Actually, carbon removals only make up 2% of total carbon credit or carbon offset markets. And we think that all environmental assets are important, but they're different fruit. And so we're focused on only making one type of fruit and really distinguishing from that. We have a system that we believe leads to true discovery through allowing buyers and sellers to come to a middle ground. And if you kind of think of Nori as building an eBay where people can bid, eBay is not the one that sets the price, it's the buyers and sellers who find that price. We have a commitment to transparency and open source. So the protocols or methodologies that are being developed with Nori will never be in a black box. Anyone can replicate them and look and take what they like from it. And it's really important to us that by building a transparent market that we're able to deliver a product of higher quality. And we primarily depend on transactions for revenues. So that's different from traditional registries where project development costs can be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars and developers can pay a lot of money, but they may not see their assets ever sell. So what that means is Nori is aligned with something that makes sure that people are getting paid. We also have a system where the assets are immediately consumable, so they can only be owned by one person. And that basically addresses a major issue right now where there's double counting and double claiming. And although unfortunately nothing really happened in the latest COP, no surprise there, but one of the challenges that the international community is currently grappling with is how to address the double entry bookkeeping, where basically assets and liabilities, traditional accounting markets, are taken care of. But what that means is if a country wants to claim something in terms of their nationally determined contribution, it actually may be claimed twice. So because of how the entire carbon market's set up. So using blockchain technology, this is a pretty easy fix, and having something immediately consumable, it is as well. I wanted to address permanence up front because this is a question that comes up a lot in carbon markets. We recognize the dynamic nature of carbon pools. Carbon goes up and down based on things that people can't control. And we also actually believe that permanence is a little bit misguided. We see the critical need that we live in is really to increase the amount of carbon stored in terrestrial biomass and pools. And what we are guaranteeing for what people are paying for in the NRT is that it is removed and retained for a minimum of 10 years. The way that we're able to do that is also by establishing a baseline at year 0 and year 10. And upon the publication of that baseline, we've now, for the first time, actually established a carbon inventory for that specific project on a field level. We actually think that permanence in traditional opposite markets is an illusion. It's not even a real thing. And so it becomes a sort of challenge that oftentimes is held up against soil carbon, which we don't think is fair. And is also created systems that require covenants on land, which become unobtainable to farmers, many of whom might be renting year-to-year leases. And so when you're stuck with a requirement that has a 40 or even 100-year covenant on your land, that's not something that is realistic, and it leads to a lot of friction in scaling the market. So where we see true permanence is actually the sequential removal and retention of carbon from the atmosphere. So if you essentially want to continue paying for permanence, you need to continue paying in these increments. It's also worth noting on permanence that there's natural respiration from systems. So we need to draw down an incremental ton of carbon dioxide once every 10 years just to sort of account for that, which hopefully for many of the experts on this call will not be news. So to get into some of the market participants, we essentially have 4 parties. I'm going to talk about the first 2 and then pass it over to Ryan. So buyers, this is people who pay for the Nori removal tons. These are individuals, companies, and governments. Earlier in the fall this year, we ran a pre-sale to sort of prove out the concept and had over 300 individuals and companies who were paying for carbon removal in excess of $80,000. Over time, we are, as a startup, still looking for product market fit. We're talking and in discussions with a number of large corporations, many of whom are signing letters of intent, which is a great signal for demand in early next year. And we also are building out our software platform to develop in a way that basically in entrepreneur jargon is a B2B2C play. So business to business to consumer, whereby businesses are able to provide carbon removal on behalf of the consumer, which actually makes those businesses more profitable. So this doesn't necessarily sit as something out of altruism, but aligns with brand values and drives more financing to initially farmers who are removing and sequestering carbon. So our first focus as a carbon removal marketplace, we hope to enable multiple methodologies in multiple regions around the world, but we're starting with carbon removal in US croplands. And to do that, we built up a scientific peer review committee. Here are some of the active members who are part of it. If there are people on this call who are interested in joining, it's a voluntary 1 hour a month minimum commitment. And please send me an email or Ryan. That's Christoph@nori.com or Ryan@nori.com. And we'll happily chat with you more of what it's about. And if it's a fit, happy to add you to the group. The point of this group is to provide input into the market design for US croplands and also have ongoing feedback and learnings and connections to the pilot as we sort of collectively author a methodology that's open and available for anyone to use. So one of the, I guess, special sauce for Nori, for lack of a better word, is to figure out how to get data without putting the hurdle on the farmer. So to do that, we have taken an approach which makes us compatible with farm management software platforms. And one of our first partners that stepped up to the plate was Granular. And Granular is a farm management software platform that has over hundreds of millions of acres and is able to provide us with some of the cropland history that we need to, and farm management records that we need to run through our platform. Ryan will get in a little bit more to that. A little out of order here. But so Granular is able to bring us suppliers. Suppliers for us are farmers who are doing something additional, which is known to draw down carbon. This is doing things that everyone on this call, I think, thinks a lot about. And the first farmer that Granular brought us who wanted to move forward is Trey Hill. There's a picture of him. Trey's smiling because he knows that he's getting paid through Nori, and he's now able to, actually emailed me on Monday and he's like, well, I'm going to use this money to buy a new roller crimper that can fit on top of my planter, and was sort of excited reinvesting the payment that he's getting back into sequestering even more carbon. And through our pilot with him, we were able to generate Trey 12,000 tons of carbon removal from vintage years 2013 to 2018. Here's a view of the software platform, and actually Trey's graciously allowed us to share this with y'all. So you can see specific projects. Each project has an owner. This is really important in traditional carbon markets to know who the owner is. So the owner needs the assignment of the right to list that credit. So in some cases, Trey is renting land, or maybe his sister owns the land, but the sister needs to assign the ownership over to Trey. When you click through in the platform, you can see here that there are specific field sets. So we are able to go field by field and then collect all of the data that we need for that field to run a report. What our platform then does when we have a complete set of data is run that through an API through Comet Farm, which Ryan will get into in a bit. And then we're able to get a projection back to Trey to see how much he might be able to earn over the next decade, which is what he'd be committing to, and the sort of average tons of CO2 he might be drawing down. what's really exciting about this is entirely free for people like Trey. And so unlike traditional carbon markets where you need to pay an upfront cost and find a project developer, if you have the data available and you have the time to go through it, you can get a free projection before paying anything and before moving forward. And we think that's a great differentiator for Nori relative to other carbon markets. Over to you, Ryan.
Yeah, so Christoph, thank you. That was just a lot of information that we downloaded there. So I just wanted to pause before we get into, some of the nitty gritty on software and requirements and why we are using a model-based approach, just to see if folks have questions or comments so far.
Yeah, this is Jeff. So I was intrigued by your comment about vintage years and trading carbon from vintage years, which, depending on what your baseline is, could also be perceived as double accounting. I'm wondering just how you're dealing with that.
Let's tag team this one, Ryan. So I guess I backed into something that I wanted to set up for Ryan to discuss later, which is that Nori's doing a pilot, and we're doing a pilot that puts money on the table for something that someone already did and they hadn't already gotten paid for. So Nori's stance is that carbon removal is a service that people want to pay for, and if you're able to provide that service that satisfies the requirements of functionality in our interpretation of the International Organization of Standardization Greenhouse Gas Accounting guidelines. So essentially, what we're saying in the pilot is if you can prove that you did something additional since 2010, you can qualify for up to 5 years worth of grandfathered NRTs. And so when I said vintage years, that's because in Nori, we're an ex post carbon market, which means you can only get paid for the environmental activity after that environmental activity occurred. And so for us to establish a marketplace, the only way that we're going to have inventory is to go back in time for that carbon removal that already got paid for. And this is our strategy to get out of the gate, and also as a way to work with farmers to say, this is going to be worth your time because you can get paid for this thing. I recognize that, so maybe I'll just stop there if you have clarifying questions to my comment.
No, I mean, I guess I'd be interested in how you chose 2010 and then how this will be presented in the context of the Paris agreements and so forth. But I think we're probably all interested in learning more about how you're actually doing it with Comet Farms. So maybe we can move forward and come back.
Yeah. Well, Ryan, you probably work in 2010 to how we're doing it with Comet Farm, because that's more there. So.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the truth of the matter is you have to start somewhere. And like Christoph said, this pilot that we're running with U.S. farmers is sort of a one-time opportunity, right? So when the pilot ends next year, we haven't set an official date yet, but it will likely be in the first half of 2020. Then really, it's our program is going to look very similar in sort of additionality or project start date terms as other programs that are out there, that it's really only on a go forward basis, right? And with that in mind, and in the context of the Paris Agreement and programs like CORSIA, which is the civil aviation industry's commitment to the Paris Accords, we have applied as a program to generate eligible units for that program, and our accounting would comply with everything that they've laid out so far. So we do have that in mind, but this pilot is sort of like the chance for U.S. farmers to really benefit now and to build up our inventory for the marketplace. So, because one thing that we don't want is for farmers to sign up, and then let's say if we do a total stock change measurement via soil sampling approach, it's minimum 3 to 5 years before any farmer is seeing any payment from it. Whereas with Comet Farm, to transition into that, we're able to simulate changes year to year and then sort of true it up with actual practice data. And then the projected, going forward 10 years then becomes the reality. And because we have a 10-year crediting period, we're able to make adjustments. And if they can beat the performance of the model, using sensor-based approaches and sampling and direct measurements and so forth, which we'll get into later and certainly in the discussion, then there's an opportunity to get even more Nori removal tons issued to your account as a supplier. So we're trying to do a flexible, like model-based, but a both-and kind of approach where we want to incorporate the latest science, but we also don't know exactly what's going to rise to the top and what's going to be cost-effective for American farmers. Because right now a lot of things are done at kind of the laboratory or the plot scale, not whole farm. And so what Comet Farm enables us to do, there's a clause missing in this, but there's this extra comma here, that it's a USDA funded tool that is built and maintained by scientists at Colorado State University, the Natural Resource Ecology Lab, NREL. And what it's doing is simulating at the whole farm scale changes in carbon stocks. It also does CO2 emissions from field burning, residue burning, or liming, nitrous oxide emission fluxes at the field scale, as well as methane. So it really encompasses whole farm quantification year by year for the 3 major greenhouse gases associated with agriculture. And it works for essentially 95% of what's out there on the US landscape. So it's a very robust and sophisticated tool. And we have essentially used that as our method for quantification in our initial croplands methodology. So in the next slide, what Comet Farm does as a modeling platform is it takes soil maps, which are coming from NRCS, the soil survey data of Surgo, weather history, which is gridded at I think it's the 1 kilometer scale, long-term projections and so forth that are used for national weather and long-term climate models. And it boils that down to the field scale, matching that grid cell to where that parcel is uploaded. And then it runs the DayCent model, which is a biogeochemical process model for a 100-year period. So you initialize it with land use change, land cover data going up to the year 2000. And then from 2000 forward, it's field scale management history that covers everything from planting and harvest dates, yield amounts like in bushels or tons per acre, all the way to tillage, fertilizer, organic matter additions, and irrigation practices. So there are about 30 unique data fields that need to be populated per year, per parcel. So it's not an infinite number of parameters, but it's certainly a lot. So I don't want to downplay the fact that there is a lot of data that is required in order to participate in this. But what Nori is doing is working with the Comet Farm team, working with our peer review committee, working with collaborators around the world to make this as seamless and intuitive as possible from the farmer's perspective, and trying to meet them where we're at without compromising standards about quality of what's going into the platform.
And Ryan, I'll just pause to say that Comet did their in-depth open team in-depth session back in September, and that's archived for folks who haven't had a chance, who are just joining this call, perhaps for the first time in the in-depth series.
Great, yeah. So then I won't get into the all the ways that it accounts for carbon, water, nitrogen cycles, and so forth, because that was probably covered in that webinar. So what's I think more important here is why Nori picked Comet Farm as its first quantifier for our methodology. So you can kind of see the points here, but this is not the only tool. This is the first tool that we're using. So I'll acknowledge that in the open team community, there are representatives from Cool Farm Tool, from the DNDC model. There are other platforms out there that are used in Europe and in other countries. So we are in conversation with many of them and are open to that, but there's some kind of base requirements or expectations that we have that are kind of laid out here that we would like to see in any quantification tool that's used for one of our open source methodologies. I guess the one that maybe Cool Farm Tool or FieldPrint or DNDC couldn't use is the consistency or current use in the official US inventory. Descent definitely has a leg up there. So that's not to preclude others, but that was something that appealed to us, is that essentially the way that the US is accounting for cropland system emissions is already using this tool, which hopefully the Comet Farm webinar went into a little bit. So yeah, so that's essentially why we're picking Comet Farm. And then of course the integration with the software was very important as well. The fact that they had an API that was available, that's public, that is usable and could integrate with Nori's technology stack. So to the extent that other quantification tools are able to offer that, that's something that our product team could seriously investigate. So we definitely welcome people's ideas and contributions in that regard. In terms of how the quantification actually works, what we're doing, so the way that Nori handles additionality is we take this baseline, dynamic baseline period where, let's say, in this case, new practices were adopted in 2014 of phasing out tillage and adding cover crops. Then we're asking for data for at least 3 years prior to that switch date, right? So that would be 2011, 12, and 13. And then we instruct the Comet Farm platform to start the model run at so there's a flexible start year that they implemented for Nori, and it's available for other users of the tool now via the API. And so the model run starts at 2014. So instead of comparing, what had been done through 2019 and then going 10 years forward, as it normally does if you're using the web interface for Comet Farm right now, with the API, you can specify the start year. And that's really critical for us because we run that for 10 years going forward. And then we look at the average because there's a lot of interannual variability to a model-based estimate of soil organic carbon stock change. And so we try to account for that in a way that is conservative and also credible, where we can extract annual soil carbon stock change estimates, but then compare that to a 10-year average, and we take the lower of the two annual average numbers. And in the case of our first supplier, Trey Hill, those two numbers, the annual averages, ended up being quite similar, but we still went with the lower of the two. So that's something that we have spelled out in section 4.3, just to get specific for a second, of our croplands methodology, which is available on Nori's website. We'll have the link at the end of the slides here. We wrote it up as just a very brief encapsulation of our approach, but we would welcome anybody on this call to weigh in on our quantification approach and offer critiques or suggestions or ways that we could maybe do this better. But we believe that it worked out very well for Trey, and that it's scalable for other US croplands suppliers. So we're still sticking with the ex post, but we're using a combination of historic and projected, and then we're looking at the period that is just reflecting current management. So that's the other average that we compare to. And then what we're looking at is the incremental removal, which is shown in the blue bars here, of what was removed from the new practices less what was removed by a continuation of their management starting in that switch date of 2014 for a 10-year period. So we're only paying for the increment. Then there's one more piece where, as I alluded to before, where if you're coming in with sensor-based measurements, it could be using the quick carbon or the bionutrient meter. If you have eddy flux towers, there are some farmers we're talking to that are part of research studies that are doing actual measurements of carbon fluxes on their farms, or soil sample test results that are, let's say, using dry combustion, and they have associated uncertainties with the soil sample test results that are in there. If you're seeing a higher soil organic carbon stock change value than what is coming out of the Comet Farm projections, then Nori can actually override or issue the difference, as long as where we're comparing the uncertainty levels, and this is explained in more detail in our croplands methodology, but we're taking, if you think of it as like a Venn diagram, like where do the two uncertainty levels touch? And so you're not getting the high end of a soil sample test result, a predicted or a measured stock change. You're getting what's essentially at the lower end of that higher value, but is still within the uncertainty of the Comet Farm model level. So I hope I did that justice. It's something that we're still working through, and we want to have more clear guidance on it. But we're going to be talking in the new year with soil sampling labs and other groups, and forming something of a working group to really codify some of this into a soil sampling and handling protocol, so we can have more clear guidance for potential suppliers who want to take advantage of this modified approach to quantification. So any questions on that before we go into what verification looks like and what pilot participation looks like?
Ryan, this is Patrick from Cool Farmer Alliance. Yeah, I was curious. You mentioned the situation in which if the measured stock change is greater, how about if it's lower than projected from Comet? Yeah,
Christoph, do you want to take that and maybe handle the insurance reserve?
You get the so if Nori overissued based on the model, we're on the hook for making that up. And so let's say that your sample soil sample test results came back and said this was lower than the model over a minimum period, which is basically what we need to see to have any statistical significance. Then Nori, and it turns out that we had already issued you these NRTs. We would be on the hook to go purchase new NRTs so that the buyer who paid for those NRTs already is made whole. And in the How Nori Works document, which is also on our resources page, we talk about the insurance reserve pool. And I don't want to go too much into tokens on this call, but we have Nori tokens, which are sort of an implementation detail in the background, and 20% of the tokens sit in a pool for that exact reason. That's also part of how we are able to make a guarantee on the 10 years of permanence.
So another way to explain that is, unlike the California Air Resources Board compliance program, we don't have buyer liability, and there's also not a project level buffer account or buffer pool account as other voluntary programs do for land-based credit programs, where it's essentially deducted or held in reserve. So we're doing it at the organizational level because Nori as a company is minting these tokens, and we can hold back a certain percentage, which is all laid out in our white paper, which we put out, in 2017, 2018. So that's, as Christoph said, an implementation detail, but it does paint some sort of contrast with other programs and how we're handling that risk. Okay, so let's move to verification briefly, and then go into some of the details of the pilot, and then some discussion, because we want to leave plenty of time for that. So I'll speed up a little bit here. So verifiers are kind of the third component. We switched up the order a little bit of suppliers, quantifiers, verifiers, buyers. So verifiers are the last piece of it. So from the supplier's perspective, the farmer that's participating, once all of your data is in the Nori app and you're sort of ready to go to submit your claim of removals to a verifier, then our software platform provides something of a matchmaking service and says, these are the whitelisted verifiers that are currently our standard that's laid out in the How Nori Works document. is that you're internationally recognized or accredited under the ISO greenhouse gas standards, the 14,000 standards. And what the verifiers are looking at is essentially, it's different than other programs. They're looking at the accuracy of evidence that's provided by the farmer. So more the data inputs, what's going into the Comet Farm platform, into the Nori software, not the model outputs, not the stock change estimates. So they're not making judgments about how Comet Farm is operating as a tool, because that's already been peer reviewed and tested. What's really essential in a modeling based approach is providing reasonable level of assurance as to the quality of the data inputs, and also looking at the right of the supplier to make that claim of carbon removal, that they have legal claim to it, so an ownership attestation, and that they're not listing their project in another marketplace, so to avoid double counting and double crediting and so forth. So that's verification. So it's done in a very streamlined way. Now, in terms of what we're looking for in a pilot project, I'm not going to read through this list here, but this is something that we're actually distilling down into an updated sort of pilot welcome document that will be available on our website shortly. So you'll get to see these criteria kind of spelled out and in this bullet form. But as Christoph mentioned, the switch date is really key for us. So if a farmer has been no-tilling for 30 years and really hasn't changed anything, this pilot is not going to be a great fit for them. However, if they've been no-tilling for a long time and then they started incorporating cover crops into their operation, say in 2015, and they have data going back to 2012, and they're at least 1,000 acres, that's going to make them a really good fit. What's critical and why the partnership with Granular is so important to us is having a consistent set of farm management records for multiple years in a row. So while we very much support other platforms, like FarmOS, and we're starting to work with farmers who are using that, some of these platforms haven't been around long enough really to establish that record. So we acknowledge the reality that people are in now, that they're probably using or bringing multiple data sets into to bear to participate in the Nori pilot. So it's more about like, how long is your record set and how consistent is it, then like it all has to be in Granular or in FarmOS or FieldView or whatever. It's more about like, can you tell that story with your data and provide assurances, that you can have these data verified by an independent third party. And if the answer is no on that, then you're also probably not going to be a good fit. So that's really key for us. You also have to be willing to sign a 10-year project registration contract. And what's key about this is that you're not being locked into like just planting cover crops year after year in the way that you were getting paid for, in the pilot period. It's that you're making every best effort to incrementally remove carbon from the atmosphere and retain it for at least 10 years. So however you do that, it's outcome-based. That where Nori is not going to be prescriptive or saying you have to do things a certain way, but you have to provide annual updates through the Nori software so that we true up the model run and look at, as a result of all the changes that you're making on your farm, then this is how the numbers change in carbon stock terms. I went over this a little bit, and I think the Comet Farm webinar might have gone into more detail, but this is something that's also available on our website. So this is just giving you a sense of what Comet Farm is needing among those 30 or so unique variables. And then how do we actually do it? So we touched on starting with a data platform like Granular. It could be that the platform has an API and we're automatically able to ingest that, or in Granular's case, the Nori product team is working on a parser, so kind of a script to help automate the translation process from one, it happens to be a JSON file type, and moving it into the Nori platform. And we're using Google Sheets as our sort of data entry template. And then the Sheets goes into the Comet Farm API. So then whenever, sorry, I'm getting over a cold. So the farmer fills in as much as they can in that Google Sheet. And then we work with the farmer and can bring other sources to bear to help fill gaps. And because we're using Google Sheets, we're able to track revision history and know what's coming from where and from who and when. So that helps with verification. So that's a really important sort of record keeping note. That's an implementation detail, but something we learned in the process with Trey, that having that traceability of data inputs and modifications is very important to the integrity of the product or the project. And so documenting, where those data inputs are coming from helps ease the verification timeline. And eventually, when it's fully implemented, the scoring procedure that Nori uses, assigning a quality score to the claims that are being made. All right, so Christoph, I'll pass it back to you, and that's good because my throat's really dry now.
Thanks, Ryan. I wanted to slide up here because I think it's central to Open Team, and what we're all thinking about is how can we show up and contribute to standards that aren't just useful for Nori, but are useful for anyone who's thinking about large packages of farm level operating data in service of holistically managing the land. And so with where we kind of see ourselves is we have certain requirements or specifications of how do we want to collect this data. These are standards which, as we figure out how they work, we want to make open because we think that it's really important, not just for carbon quantification, but really any ecosystem service tracking, or rather any farm level management data that might be useful for insurance or really what have you, perhaps selling up the supply chain. We're finding, there might be different definitions of tillage or different definitions of how people might be looking at some of the other specifications through Comet Farm. So where Nori sits is that we have to clean and normalize a lot of data. So we see that opportunity to share the standards that we're using with the broader community as they become relevant. As a non-software person who's trying to sound intelligent, any software developer will say, well, first you have to do something manually before you can even talk about the API. And that's really our process with any platform, whether it's Farm OS, Granular, or many of the others who've made us sign NDAs so we can't be so vocal about it. But it's, let's find the farmer, let's take the package of the data, let's look at it, let's parse it, let's figure out what are the requests that we need to put on what format they send it. So we are eager to continue to contribute in that way. Ryan sort of touched on, we're doing things to parse the data. You can refer to these as algorithms that will be open source and hopefully useful. And so it's a key challenge that we have right now is when we don't have a complete set of farm management history, where can we rely on certain proxies to get us that data, or where can we be working toward algorithms that can fill these things in? So again, anything that Nori is doing on this front is open source, and we're very keen to be working with others who are trying to open source these tools. The third question is really what else? And so I leave this to everyone on the audience. If anyone has ideas based on what you learned on this call, other things that we might be able to be doing that contribute in the open source community. And maybe we'll just start there and then open it up to more questions that people have. I do have one. Another thing that we're going to open source is our soil sampling and handling protocol. This is something that's going to work in Nori. We're aware of other ecosystem service markets, and if they want to use these too, great. We all move faster.
Christoph, I wonder if you might also talk a little bit about sort of the app side of that you're developing, and how you see that connecting, how this you see the marketplace connecting in more with some of both the in-field data collection, but also some of these other management tools.
I can speak at a high level, and maybe Ryan, you can get more specific. So it's, as an entrepreneur, you kind of go week by week. Each week is a different adventure. So the adventure of this week is plugging into a new farm management software platform that's giving us all sorts of data that we don't actually need. That platform certainly needs. And we're finding this interesting tension where to maintain our promise of data security and also straight to farmers that we really only want the carbon removal data, oftentimes are collecting much less than what other farm management software platforms might be collecting. And so it's important that as we work toward moving from a manual, let's take whatever you can export and then run it into our app, into an automated, these things can talk to each other, that we find those linkages. But I just want to note that a lot of what Nori is able to feed back, and the value is that you have an independent verifier who has provided a level of assurance on the farm level operating data that gives now that package back to the farmer in a way that's useful. Ryan, do you want to take that deeper? And I guess just to speak to the app, and I'll be candid, we are building this as a minimum viable product. And so a very complicated and complex Google Sheet runs the guts of what we need to collect. On top of that, we then need to send that through to Comet Farm via an API. So right now that's built into our platform. But I really think it's the being able to normalize data that can run through Nori, that can run to Comet Farm, that can talk to each other in certain standards of how do we accept different shape files, all of which is different. So we're in this sort of sticky learning by doing phase without really knowing how it's going to evolve. But Ryan, maybe you've got more.
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, the dream is for all these platforms to be interoperable, right? I mean, that's Open Team is very committed to that. So Nori can't do that on our own, but we're also not going to just be on the sidelines waiting for things to change. So that's why we've rolled up our sleeves with Granular. There are other groups that we're talking to. Another platform is Farmers Business Network. It's we're getting in there and we're trying to figure out okay, you say you have an API, you say you have data portability and whatever else, but how does it actually work? What is actually exported? Is it sufficient to populate, the data template that we have? And, what we're finding in a lot of cases, not all of them and not all the ones we're currently working with, is that, there's sort of the rhetoric and then there's the reality. There's the commitment to something and then there's what's actually implemented. And there's a gulf between the two in a lot of cases. And so that's where we really need this community to rally around these concepts and, help us build something that's going to help farmers. Because we're not doing this for just our own gain. We want this to be useful to the whole community and to farmers in the long term. If you want a good way of having your management data summarized and the Nori product can help you do that, that's great. Then you keep that product, you own it. What we need is just these key inputs to run this tool.
I want to give folks a chance to jump in here too, but in the meantime, I have another question in terms of, we've talked almost exclusively about cropping systems, and I know we have a lot of participants in rangeland management and grazing systems, so maybe you might say a couple words on how you're handling that.
I can maybe I can just jump in here a little bit, and I guess my biggest question is around how to make it easy for people to put in the data, because that in my mind is one of the, I mean, I'm sure you're experiencing this too, is one of the biggest barriers. How do you make it easy for people to put in the data and make it in a form that's useful for you? Like, my question for you is, what do you think would make it easier? Like, is it figuring out what the right specification is, figuring out what, like integrating with more existing tools, or maybe it's all of the above? I'm trying to get a sense of where you see the data collection challenge is.
Where I'm trying to start is by minimizing the burden for the number of unique inputs, and so the way that we've conceptualized it internally is, almost like a flow chart of like, if you're doing this, then we're going to ask you more questions, but if you're not doing it, then we're not going to like leave these as blank required fields, right? So it's sort of scaling down or scaling up or scaling out, the data request in the context of what the producer is doing. So I think that that's one way of going about it. And then, these proxy or autofill records for, let's say, the period of 2000 through 2009, which Comet Farm currently requires, but most farmers don't have, independently verifiable records for that. And that's not necessarily material to what is actually being credited, quantified through our methodology. So that's on sort of our back end, is working on reducing the number of years that are required. And then finally, which Google Sheets already enables, is sort of pattern detection and being able to like, okay, if this is my rotation, if it's corn, soy, and wheat, or I'm grazing animals on it, every winter, on the stubble, then you take those patterns and you copy it across years, across fields, so that you're making it easier for the farmer to say, these are the patterns that I'm doing, and then this is where they apply, and then fine tuning from there.
Yeah, so
Christoph, do you want to speak to grazing and just how the sequence fits in?
Sure.
Yeah.
And it's great to have PastureMap on it, because I will publicly say, like, PastureMap is the first data platform we want to be working with on grazing. So
okay.
know that, George, we're coming for you. We're a 10-person like scrappy startup that is totally overextended, and in a way not having bandwidth to work on a grazing lands methodology, which we absolutely intend on integrating into our platform, I think is a benefit for the community to self-organize itself, which from Nori's perspective means that we need it to satisfy the criteria of additionality, which to our view has not come to a consensus. So the most important thing to move forward in a pilot is to have those land stewards, those land managers, to say, what is the additional thing I'm doing that is going to draw down additional carbon? And where can we have an agreement on those indicators? The next step from that is to then identify a few ranches, and dozens have come to us and have said, pick me. And we're like, great, cool. When we know of you, and thanks for saying that, when you're ready. And some of them we've even said, go talk to PastureMap first and get all your data in PastureMap, because that's going to make everything easier. But we need the verification of this new practice, whether this is a form of holistic management or what have you. And we'd love to be pushing the community in the consensus to that end. I'll be blunt, it may be, and I say this on December 19th, 2019, it may be that as a result of a pilot in the grazing lands methodology, in order to determine we're not able to operate a carbon removal market for grazing lands. You might still indeed be able to track the removals and retention. And it may be that something like land to market with the Savory Institute is the best way to do that. I think in our dream world, land to market can become a stamp on the projects that might also be selling NRTs through Nori, so that those ranchers are really appreciating the stacking benefits of direct payments for carbon removal and whatever seal that helps them sell at a premium. So the other piece too, and Ryan, maybe I'm going to pass it back to you, but the way that Comet works is through a soil monitoring network of over, I think, almost 1,500 sites. And what we'd be looking for is a similar soil monitoring network in ranging lands that the NRCS has expressed interest in supporting. And so as we scale up the pilot, finding those specific ranches that want to sort of use those efforts. I think it's worth calling out Point Blue as a great partner in looking to good soil sampling and handling protocols for ranging land. As I know that sort of there's already sort of carbon market ideas that are using these protocols. So I think we'd be looking to not reinvent the wheel, but throw our weight behind supporting efforts that are ongoing. But Ryan, do you want to further comment on
that? Was great. I don't have anything to add to that. And I'm also watching the clock here. I think we have about 1 minute officially. So any other burning questions?
We do, but I think I like how we ended this, because I think this what else is a big part of where this community can help contribute to our understanding of these other systems and some of the types of verification for complex agricultural management systems, where we're not just grazing, but grazing on some of the more complex practices where we're grazing on croplands where they aren't really well modeled yet, and that's, I think, one of the outcomes that we'll be helping to generate are some of those data sets, and some consensus. And part of that is this idea of continual improvement and having a finer grained understanding of not just sort of high level practices, but some of the nuance, and that grazing, it's not just that you're grazing, but how you're grazing is really detailed. And part of the sort of the verification will be the records that our community, I think, will help generate. So I'm really pleased to end on that, and thank you, George, for joining us today too.
Yeah, I'm excited about how PastureMap could contribute to this. We'll talk some more later.
Good. Well,
Christoph, you want to close this out? Sorry, we just have the more info and contact stuff. So then.
So if you are a farmer who wants to join Q1, we're ready for you. Email pilot, that'll go to me, Ryan, and a few others, and we'll get you through as quickly as possible.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan and Christoph. I'm sure we'll have. We should schedule another one in 6 months to dive in dive in deeper again.
Yeah.
Or maybe it'll be about grazing. Yeah.
Thanks, George.
Exactly.
Yeah, we'll have more to share. All right.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yep. Bye, everyone.
Bye.